Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I am here with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
What is up, Brian? Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Lots of exciting, quick stuff
Lots
today.
of exciting,
Lightning
kind of a quasi lightning round episode that we're going to go through today. Very happy to be here with you. We're recording on a Friday afternoon, Friday, February 11. Some interesting late breaking events that have affected our topic list today. So we're excited to jump into that in just a moment. Before we do, the normal introductory notes: we are not giving legal advice. We are not sharing any confidential information. And all views that you hear on this program are mine and Tim's. If you do not like them, blame us. Do not blame anyone else. If you like the pod, please spread the word. Please subscribe. You can get us. You can hear us anywhere you get your pod content. And we are here every 2 weeks. Thank you for joining, as always. Thanks to everyone who we heard from after the last episode. We got a little more Russia content. We've been Russia heavy this calendar year. We got more Russia content, but late breaking news has bumped Russia back in our agenda a little bit. So we are going to start today with the pretty big news relating to Afghanistan and the new executive order that was just issued today relating to the funds that are in the U.S. that are from the Afghanistan Central Bank. So we're going to start there. We're going to check in on JCPOA 2.0 and lay some bets as to what we think is coming here in the final, perhaps the final stretch of the negotiations on that. We're going to then get to Russia and talk about Russia and their new BFF, China. And then that is going to pave the way for more China content through the end of the program. We're going to talk about the Hytera indictment that just came down a couple days ago. And then we're going to end with an interesting China-related CFIUS case that just made the news recently. We're going to talk about that to wrap things up. So, like I said, we're gonna keep this relatively streamlined today. We're not going to do. It's not technically a lightning round episode. We have no lightning round today. So please don't add us if you're big fans of the lightning round. We're going to keep this pretty streamlined, though. We're going to go sort of one central question per topic, and that's going to be our episode for today. Tim, before we get started, any thoughts? I thought this was going to be the happy hour edition because we're doing this late on a Friday. What happened? What happened? We blew that.
The caterers really dropped the ball on that, I think. And you can add us if you'd like the lightning round and you miss it. I mean, we can probably handle that.
We're big boys. We can handle that. But without any further delay, let's jump into it. So, topic number one, late breaking, as I said, Afghanistan. So we were planning to touch base and talk about Afghanistan a bit today anyway, because there were some developments in late December and recently with some issuance of some new general licenses and a number of new FAQs and guidance relating to mostly humanitarian aid to Afghanistan and dealings with the Taliban and the like, and things that we have talked about quite a bit before and that are weighing heavily on any sort of interactions with the country at the moment. But that has been superseded somewhat by what happened today, which is the issuance of a new executive order relating to the funds that are being held in the United States on behalf of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. And so we're going to talk about that instead, DAB as it is known. And so this executive order literally just got released within the last few hours. And essentially, for anybody who hasn't seen this, it sort of explicitly blocks all of the funds that are held in the United States that are the property of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. And then it directs the U.S. financial institutions who hold those funds to take certain actions, namely to consolidate and transfer all of those funds to an account held at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And the other big news that is coming with this, that has been now touted in certain public statements from the administration and also reported on, I believe, first in the New York Times, we will give them credit. The plan for these funds is that there's approximately or somewhere in excess of $7 billion in funds that are held that are the property of the DAB, the central bank in the US. And those are to be essentially jointly carved up, half of which will be going toward humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, half of which will be available to litigants in 9/11 related litigation in the US who have won judgments against the Taliban for their support of terrorism and have outstanding unsatisfied judgments against them. That has recently been a topic of a lot of action in the court system in recent months. So that is what has now been proposed as the way forward for these funds after many, many months of debate as to what should happen. The Taliban, of course, made a claim to these funds and said, well, we're the rightful government of Afghanistan and we should give us our $7 billion. And not surprisingly, that's not what happened. But I think the question that I want to tee up for you, Tim, is a broad one. What do we make of all this? And do we think this is going to work as planned, or do we think that this is now, we're now about to sort of go through the looking glass a little bit with respect to these funds and how they're planning to be used? Because obviously there's a lot of complexity in terms of how this will work, both in terms of what the portion of the funds that could be used for to satisfy these judgments in the U.S. and of course trying to actually route the funds successfully to humanitarian causes in Afghanistan and avoid the intervention of the Taliban in doing that. So what do we think? What do we think we're going to see next, and what do you make of this generally as a resolution to this kind of pretty thorny problem that has been lingering for the past several months?
It's interesting. I mean, it's not a traditional sanction that we like to talk about, where you have kind of enforcement risks and kind of priorities, and you have to figure out like who's really in the line of fire and what does it mean. I mean, here there's a pot of money. It's in the U.S. The U.S. is going to be, I predict that the money will be transferred to the Fed successfully, so that part of the program is going to work.
That's a bold prediction. Bold.
It's I like to go out on a limb. But I think that, and then the second part of it, has two pieces. One is the money that's going to go to the 9/11 victims. I think that's that piece will work as well.
The question is, going to take some time, obviously. And
it'll definitely take some time, and how you divide it up and who has a claim to it. That's definitely going to take some time, but that'll be manageable. I mean, my understanding is that that's been done already with respect to some funds with respect to the 9/11 victims, and there are similar programs with respect to money that is been confiscated to be used to what the U.S. government would call the victims of the Iranian government. And so like those programs have some traction, and they're entirely within the control of U.S. actors. And so again, I think it'll probably work. It's the piece in terms of getting humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. I mean, that piece is going to require transfers that the Taliban touches at some point, or potentially touches at some point. There are general licenses that allow for that, but as we know, once you have to start moving money across international lines into heavily sanctioned areas, or to areas that are governed by a sanctioned government, it becomes just much more tricky. And so I think you'll probably see the same sort of problems that we see with humanitarian aid in sanctioned countries. Maybe this is a way to streamline it. I mean, the money is actually going to be coming from the U.S. government. Maybe banks will trust those sorts of transfers more than they will trust transfers from private actors that try to move through the financial system despite the presence of sanctions issues. I mean, again, what we're talking about is money that should smoothly move through the financial system in theory, but in practice doesn't. So maybe having the U.S. government involved will make it a little easier. Maybe it won't. I guess we'll see with that. But that's the part of the program that I think is still, whether it'll work is up for grabs. The rest, I feel pretty confident in my predictions.
Yeah, I think
that they will work.
I think the only additional point that I would throw on top of that, which is more or less what we were going to cover anyway with respect to Afghanistan before this all came about today, is that big question of whether or not the relevant financial institutions who are going to have to be relied upon to some degree to get this money from point A to point B in Afghanistan, and to the groups that will be able to deploy it in Afghanistan, are going to be willing to take comfort in this action and the related assurances and guidance and authorities that the U.S. has put in place to try to facilitate that, right? Obviously, we know there are now a host of general licenses and FAQs and other things that are designed to help facilitate the more or less the free flow of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, to the people of Afghanistan. And we know directly from the questions and the issues that we run into on behalf of our clients that there are still a lot of problems and a lot of delays and a lot of questions and a lot of fears about being able to do that. And I think that this speaks, I think this is going to, again, we said this, I think, at the outset, right after the fall of Afghanistan last year, but I think this is, now we're really getting to kind of rubber meets the road time now that these funds are going to be freed up. This is a fascinating test case to see if the U.S. government and if OFAC can really change the behavior and the calculus of how the financial infrastructure globally thinks about these things, and whether or not they can really be used in an effective way. And I say effective meaning, hopefully not holding these things up endlessly, such that compliance considerations outweigh the needs of the people who are suffering on the ground in Afghanistan, to the point where it basically undercuts the entire purpose of this exercise. Whether that can really be achieved, and I think, and to the administration's, it's to a person, the administration has said that is their goal, to not to do everything they can to ease that suffering of the Afghan people and to get aid to the people who need it. We shall see. I mean, I think we're about to see, and the infrastructure around that and all of the related, to Tim's point, this isn't a traditional topic, but this is so embedded with sort of how the sanctions and AML compliance infrastructure works globally. It is going to be interesting to see if this is truly a path to achieve this identified goal, or whether we're going to be mired in the same kinds of compliance sort of stuck in the mud considerations that we see in many other contexts, even with all of these things in place to potentially alleviate that. So we just wanted to sort of tee this one up. Obviously, this is brand new. We'll have additional conversation on this, but I don't know if you have any final thoughts. But
just real quick, I mean, if it works, maybe it'll become a model.
Maybe.
I mean, there are a lot of sanctioned countries where the governments have money that is in, frozen pots that the U.S. would potentially have access to. And if the U.S. government decides this worked well with Afghanistan, nothing would really stop it from trying to go seize money from Iran or Venezuela or countries that are under sanction, and decide that the U.S. government would do a better job of getting humanitarian aid to the people than either the government that's in place or NGOs.
Yeah, no, agreed. Obviously, complicated issues, perhaps relating to whether it's kind of, as a policy matter, wise for the U.S. to kind of unilaterally act to do that with respect to another government's money. But here, I think that seems not to be as much a concern, given that the Taliban is entrenched, at least for the moment, in Afghanistan. So, in all events, that we'll leave that one behind, but wanted to start with that, as that is an issue that I know has been a lot of good folks in the U.S. government, including some we know very well, have been working hard on that in recent months, and so a bit of an inflection point there, and we will see where we go from there. With that, let's move on to another one of our favorite topics, which is JCPOA 2.0.
So this one really will be a lightning round, as opposed to the earlier topic, which was a big topic because it came out today. So we weren't planning on it, but this is Iran. We talk about it most episodes, and we kind of give our bi-weekly prediction or bi-weekly observation of where things stand. in connection with the JCPOA talks, and we're basically where we were the last time, which is we're near the end of the window in which these talks have the possibility to be successful. I think the only thing that I would add here, because that's something that the U.S. government has said, it said before the last episode of the podcast, it has said since the last episode of the podcast, it is repeating that time is short, time is short. The thing that I think we're seeing now that reinforces that message is that the Senate is also starting to repeat, and these are senators from both sides of the aisle repeating that time is short for the potential for an Iran deal for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about, because the Iran deal as written was scheduled to start expiring in 2025. That was a critique of the Iran deal. The closer we get to that date, the sanctions, the sort of nuclear restraints that Iran puts into place become less and less valuable. And so as time passes, the chances that the U.S. would give up sanctions or provide sanctions relief in exchange for less and less valuable nuclear restraint by Iran, I think becomes a lot less. The one thing that I would add to that, though, is the articles that I'm seeing repeat that we are in a crisis in Iran because Iran has gotten much, much closer to being able to make a nuclear weapon. By some reports, is very, very close, even weeks away, when during the JCPOA, the thinking was that it was years away. And so the current strategy clearly has gotten Iran very close to a nuclear weapon. And so the question is there another strategy that will at least keep it away for years? Because right now the U.S. trade policy has gotten Iran within weeks of a nuclear weapon, and so we can probably do better than that in JCPOA 2.0. However it looks, we'll probably do better than that. So that's really where I think things stand. It's not that much different than last week, but I think time really is running out, and the pressure is starting to build. If it's now or never.
So I'm gonna play the devil's advocate in the side of the doomsday clock here and say that I think we may be past the point of no return where a deal might not be possible. And those who are perhaps tired of hearing us talk about this, one of the reasons that we talk about it all the time is that we continue to get questions on a regular basis to forecast what may be happening. And we know that companies, especially in certain parts of the world, Europe in particular, are very, very interested in this because they would be interested in potentially getting back into Iran in the event there is a deal. So we are thinking about and talking about this still on a pretty regular basis. I do think, given where things stand in terms and the latest intel and the latest reporting on sort of where things are with regard to the enrichment of materials to make a nuclear weapon in Iran, are pretty dire and suggest that we may very well be past the point of no return. I just can't really see what brings us out of this at this point. So I'm going to stick with. We declared JCPOA 2.0 dead at the end of 2021. I know there's a lot of, well, maybe not. Things look good. There's some people who are trying to, tout an optimistic outcome here. I'm sticking with it's dead.
So you're taking the under.
I'm taking the under. Given that we're coming up on Super Bowl weekend here in the U.S., I'm taking the under. Tim's taking the over. The point spread is getting larger by the day. I feel like this is like getting a deal done is more of an underdog than ever, I think, right now. So I'm sticking with the under. At some point we will presumably have a concrete discussion about this on the podcast when it is really dead or really coming back into play. But for now, we do feel somewhat duty bound to continue to come back to this, at least briefly. If
it happens, it's such a big deal that it's worth continuing to talk about. And if it doesn't happen, it still is taking up a lot of U.S. government time trying to bring it back into play. And look, I'm probably on the less than 50% side too, but I'm close to 50%. And the reason is because the deal would be so much better than the status quo, which is also very dangerous. But I also get that there's lots of pressures that will push us away from any sort of deal, and they're probably going to get stronger as opposed to weaker.
Yep. All right. Well, that's all we wanted to say about JCPOA 2.0 for this week. with that, we will move on to, of course, Russia and China. As a couple, BFFs, I referred to them at the beginning of the episode, and then we're going to segue into a lot of China content to bring us home today. So we've obviously talked about Russia quite a bit in the last several episodes, and what I really want to frame for us is the following question, which was reported on, we have touched upon previously, and which was reported upon quite a bit in the last week or so, on the heels of two things: the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in Beijing, and President Putin's visit to China to coincide with that, along with many other world leaders, not, of course, the US because of the diplomatic boycott. And coming out of the meetings that President Putin had um, in China around the beginning of the Olympics, many reports of understandings and deals for oil and gas related projects, many billions of dollars of deals that had been agreed to and arrangements that had been struck during those talks and in conjunction with many other talks that are ongoing. And of course, the natural takeaway from this is that Russia is trying to signal to the US and to Europe that it is impervious to whatever the sanctions they may levy if and when Russia decides to invade Ukraine. So, and by the way, just today, the US government has issued a warning to American citizens in Kiev and in Ukraine to basically evacuate because a Russian invasion could come at any time. So that's where we still stand, is on the precipice of a potential invasion, and then all of the consequences and the sanctions and the other measures that we've talked about in the last couple episodes. What I want to ask you, Mr. O'Toole, is the following. Will the US, let's assume that Russia invades, let's assume the US imposes some crushing sanctions, as it is warned that it will, and the EU backs that up at least to some degree. And China steps in to fill the void for its good pal, Russia. And they say, don't worry, we will sell you and we will consume whatever it is that you have to sell. It's all good, Vlad. We're here for you. And they step into the void and they at least help to ameliorate the consequences of the crushing sanctions that the US, EU, and others may impose on Russia. What would it take, or let me phrase it in two ways. Would the US ever have a stomach to come after China for blatantly disregarding and most likely violating, or at least putting themselves in jeopardy of being subject to secondary sanctions as a result of its actions to continue doing business with Russia? Would the U.S. ever have stomach for that? And if it would, what would that look like? What do you think would it take to incense the U.S. to a point that it would actually call China's bluff? Because as we know, China has essentially given the U.S. the middle finger with respect to Iran, with respect to North Korea, and with respect to any real threat of major sanctions enforcement or action that could really harm China or the Chinese economy in a major way. So what would it take, and would the U.S. ever have a stomach to go after China with respect to Russia? Would that be the tipping point?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying, as in Iran, I think we are just at the point of where we're going to find out soon, one way or the other, because my understanding is that Ukraine's winters are sufficiently cold that right now the Russian tanks could drive over the entire country because all the rivers are frozen. That will end in a matter of weeks, as I understand it. And so Russia's either going to invade or they're not. And so then the next phase would kick in. And hopefully the answer is not. But if the answer were yes, the U.S. would impose what they've called crushing sanctions. Russia really has one major sector in its economy, a couple others, but energy is by far their biggest sector. And so the U.S. sanctions would be designed to cripple the Russian energy sector. China needs energy. China is our competitor. China is not anxious to uphold whatever the U.S. is doing, although I will say I'm not sure China's crazy about an aggressive Russian army that it shares a border with running around trying to just kind of invade sovereign countries, but it doesn't look like those tanks are headed China's way anytime soon. So China may still be willing to play ball and has indicated that it will play ball and start buying sanctioned energy. The U.S. response, you'd have to see what China's doing. But the U.S., I will say, after President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA, the U.S. did start to come after China when it was buying Iranian oil. Now, that stopped in the Trump administration, and that pause is at least continued for now in the Biden administration, in part because of the negotiations in Vienna. And there is a threat to reimpose them if the talks break down. But I think you'd see the same process in China. I think the U.S. would probably pick a fight if China does what it has suggested it will do in these other articles, and the fight would look like secondary sanctions. Putting on the SDN list big Chinese purchasers of Russian oil, including state-owned entities that do that. I mean, we've seen it with Huawei, we've seen it with ZTE. I think the U.S. knows how to go after China with sanctions. The question is this the breaking point? Like, is this where where the world splits into two with respect to financial institutions, and there's a Chinese side, Chinese-Russian side, and Iran and some of the other countries are probably going to fall in that bucket? Or do we stay kind of in the same boat we are now, where when the U.S. sanctions, it imposes great consequences because nobody can break away from the U.S. financial system?
But here's my question, or my follow-on comment to that, which is, yes, the U.S. did go after certain Chinese interests with respect to what they were doing vis-a-vis Iran, but arguably it was understood that was not going to really have a deterrent effect. It was more of a symbolic gesture to sort of say you can't just flagrantly violate the sanctions and no consequences will come. And if there was really truly the desire to deter further mischief on behalf of China with respect to Iran, or certainly now in the coming months, perhaps with respect to Russia, there could be a much bigger, more comprehensive push and response that would really impose some pain if the U.S. wished to do that. I don't know that we would sort of consider it maybe it's maximum pressure light or something along those lines, where you could see whether it's big players, big entities in China, as you mentioned, in those industries, whether it's big sectors, whether there's all kinds of ways that it could come about. But I think the question of what that could look like and whether or not, again, there are all kinds of ways that we discuss this on a regular basis in terms of what do you need to be worrying about with respect to China if you have exposure there, whether it's your supply chain, customer base, operations, whatever. But this is another really interesting wrinkle here, which is could this really, to your point, I think, could this signal a new era where they have now sort of so firmly align themselves with kind of the rogue nations of the world and the U.S. enemies that there's just kind of no getting past that, and the U.S. feels that it has no choice but to act strongly and swiftly to try to deter that. I would also say another related point is, and I've seen this commented upon in a number of different circles by knowledgeable observers, China may very well be watching how this all plays out with respect to Russia and Ukraine, so that they can say, Taiwan's looking pretty vulnerable there. And if we go take Taiwan, what is the U.S. really going to do? Or what are the consequences of that really going to be? And this may be a little bit of a test balloon for China to see what the U.S. is willing to do and what other U.S. allies are willing to do, and then perhaps be able to better approximate what the cost of their potential invasion of Taiwan might be. And so, this is hugely complicated from that standpoint, and I think the U.S. will have to be thinking somewhat along those lines as well in terms of anything that they formulate that's going to be designed to hit China with respect to what it's doing on Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to get messy if that's what all that happens, because even Russia is a big country for the U.S. to try and take on with sanctions. And obviously the Chinese economy is multiples bigger than Russia. And so if China sides with Russia on this, so essentially we've got to take the fight from Russia to China, the ability of U.S. sanctions to do that is limited. It's going to be even more limited if Western Europe is not united in going after that as well, because China, I think, has seen over the last 5 years or so, kind of, it's been able to envision what a world would look like in which the U.S. and Chinese economies are more disentangled than they are right now. I don't think China has really thought through what the world would look like if it was basically split in two and you had the U.S. and Europe on one side and Russia and the rogue, or China and the rogue states on the other side. And so whether Western Europe, whether the NATO allies really stick with that sort of policy if the U.S. got tough on China would be one question. And then the other question, I think you're exactly right to raise this, is if we try and fail, what do we say to China when they start saying, okay, we're going into Taiwan? We'll start telling them we're going to come after you with massive sanctions, and their response is going to be, oh, like the massive sanctions you came after us with the last time.
They'll shrug. Yeah, they'll shrug and they'll ignore, because I think that's exactly right. I think your point about what Europe and the NATO allies will do is a good one, because certainly with respect to Russia right now, the everybody seems to be roughly aligned, although there's not perfect alignment between the U.S. and the NATO allies. But with China, the U.S. has largely been not exactly going it alone, but way more aggressive and way out in front of anything that other kind of lesser economies and lesser global powers have been willing to do, because they just don't want to incur the wrath of China. And so I think that remains a very real obstacle to have any kind of multilateral pressure on China, unless or until there's some real outlier, completely unanticipated type action that they take that perhaps is puts us at a point of no return. But I can't even.
Germany.
Go ahead.
Germany won't even commit to sanctioning Nord Stream 2 right. As to Russia if Russia actually goes in and invades and takes over the entire country of Ukraine.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well. Doesn't bode well.
So the idea that Germany would then have the stomach to not only, hold firm on Russian sanctions, but then if China, provides support to Russia in evading the sanctions, to then kind of jump on board and join the sanction train with respect to China, seems a bit far-fetched. Maybe it'll happen, but if it doesn't happen, that creates problems in its own right for the U.S., because then does it start to sanction Germany? I mean, it really becomes very difficult to see how this plays out if the U.S. doesn't keep the allies on board. But it also becomes very difficult to see how this plays out if China sides with Russia and then the allies, at least some of them, split off from the U.S. in terms of sanctions. Like, where does the U.S. go from there? It just gets really messy really quick.
Yeah, agreed. So anyway, that is for this week. That's our Russia discussion. Obviously, we'll be back on this before too long, but I think that's a real fascinating angle that we've kind of hinted at previously and wanted to consider and talk through in a bit more depth, because that is, as Tim said, this is going to get really messy, and this aspect of it is one of the messiest. And so what that means and what things will look like 6 months or a year from now is just really hard to predict, and could be really disruptive to the way that folks have organized themselves and their businesses and their compliance assumptions and all kinds of things. So this is the type of thing that we're talking about with our clients more and more, and people should be thinking about if they're not already. So
yeah, I mean, the idea of a shooting war essentially spilling over into a new trade war is not talked about that much. I mean, the talk has really been what'll happen with respect to Russia sanctions, but it could get much bigger very quickly if all the dominoes start to fall that we've talked about.
The ripples here know no bounds, I think. So in any event, we'll leave that for now, but we're going to stay with China, and we're actually going to pivot back to our last two topics for today are sort of a piece with the DOJ China initiative discussion that we had the last time, because I think these would both comfortably fall to some degree within the scope of that initiative. And so I'm going to flip it to Tim to introduce a fascinating sort of new indictment that just came down the other day, and what that might mean.
Well, one of the big issues that's always been involved in trade talks and in trade disputes between the U.S. and China has been the U.S. view that China, the Chinese government, and Chinese companies are trying to steal U.S. technology. And so, with that in mind, we're going to talk quickly about an indictment that came down in Chicago, in federal court in Chicago, earlier this week, in which a company called Hytera Communications was charged with a 21 count indictment. Now, I've taken a look at the indictment, and there are plenty of other individuals who are likely to be charged as well. Those that at least on the version that I saw, was still redacted as to who they're going to go after. But the indictment was based on what is alleged. Hytera is alleged to have hired employees to then go work for Motorola Solutions and steal proprietary technology with respect to communications, so walkie-talkie and radio technology. It's called DMR technology, and essentially use their positions at Motorola to get into the company database and access the trade secrets that it can then pass on to Hytera. That's the gist of the indictment. So I guess a pretty big example. I think we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars worth of this stuff. And the reason that I take that number, or the place that I get that number from, is that there was a civil suit in which many of these allegations were aired, in which Motorola sued Hytera and won. And this criminal case apparently stems from the civil suit. This conduct apparently continued up through 2020, so it's relatively recent, although it dates back to 2007, so it's been going on for a long time. I think this is a good example of DOJ's China initiative playing out in other parts of the country. We see the indictment in Chicago. It's not an SDNY indictment. It's going after one of what the U.S. would say is the key issues in the dispute, and it seems to be a pretty egregious example of that, at least based on the indictment. Obviously, an indictment is just a charge, but this has also been the subject of a civil case, and so there appears to be some fact development that's been done, maybe considerable fact development that's been done before the indictment. So the case is off the ground and on the way, and worth watching.
Yeah, it's just a couple of additional comments. So for folks who are, so I worked on a number of these theft of trade secret cases and economic espionage cases when I was at DOJ, and there was typically, this is a good illustration of what happens many times, which is there is a private civil litigation that is launched by the victim company here, Motorola, to try to make themselves whole for what they allege were the theft of their proprietary information, trade secrets, sensitive technology. And obviously here they've already prevailed, and they've already prevailed to a tune of already over $500 million in damages, so quite a bit. But nevertheless, to Tim's point, I think this kind of action is kind of core to what the DOJ China initiative was really envisioned to be, which is a surging of resources and a highlighting of the risks of this type of action by Chinese companies, by the Chinese government, to go after this valuable U.S. IP, trade secret, control technology, etc. And so, there aren't that many of these are difficult and usually arduous cases to investigate and to charge and to bring. But obviously, this indictment was under seal for quite a while and was just unsealed. So it was charged last year and just unsealed within the past few days. So, sort of an interesting wrinkle here that they have unsealed when they did, and that they did decide to make a decision to bring a follow-on criminal indictment when there was already a remedy, so to speak, for the victim company because they had already succeeded in their civil litigation. But I think important from a deterrence standpoint and from a policy, sort of a via law enforcement policy making, tool to bring cases like this. And so I think this is a really good and very high profile example of that. And I think all the more so because Hytera, for those who pay attention to this, they're a name that's been out in the public domain, not just in connection with this lawsuit that predates the indictment. And they were named as an entity in the Section 889 of the fiscal year 2019 NDAA, which for folks in the government contract space know very well, and Tim and I deal with this as well. Huawei, ZTE, and a few other Chinese companies, very high-profile Chinese communications companies that were named there, and that has very real and significant consequences for government contractors in the U.S. So Hytera was part of that group of companies, and then the FCC similarly named them as an entity that raised national security concerns. I believe that came out in early 2021 as well. So they've been on the radar as kind of a national security threat, if you will, for quite some time in the sort of telecom space, and with respect to controlled technologies, sensitive technologies, access to government information, et cetera. So it makes sense as a rounding out of the U.S. government strategy that they would go after a company like Hytera and indict and try to, and also, as Tim mentioned, clearly some other individuals have already been indicted, that are still under seal. Some other individuals that maybe are still being investigated could be charged in the future. So, a pretty splashy, pretty big impact trade secret theft case as these things go. There are not that many of these. They only, Huawei is charged with theft of trade secrets, not in one of the pending indictments against them. There are not that many that are out there. These are, again, hard cases to investigate and charge. So I think notable from that perspective, and ties into many of the other sort of thematic threads that we have talked about, that we talked about on a regular basis, but that we were just talking about in particular last week with respect to DOJ's China initiative. And I do think that to the extent that that lives on, or that the core principles or the core objectives of that live on, as we discussed last week, this is the type of thing you will see, more so than our non-traditional collector MIT professor type cases. It is these types of cases. So I think notable from that perspective as well, that this one gets unveiled shortly on the heels of that dismissal in the other case that we talked about in the last episode.
Now, this sort of case makes sense in the China initiative. It is directed at China, but it's directed at a real harm that is something that the U.S. government's been talking about for years.
Yep, agreed. So that's all we really wanted to cover on that one. We'll, there could be some more follow on as this case moves along. We should see what happens with it, but just wanted to call that to everyone's attention since it just got, again, unsealed and publicized just very recently. So moving along now to our final topic, we are flying, no pun intended, with our last topic. We're going to talk now about a CFIUS matter, involving Icon Aircraft. And this is a shout out to the Wall Street Journal for some really good reporting on this. So if those of you who have not seen this, we would encourage you to go to the journal to read up on this. They've covered this matter a few times recently, but there was particularly a really good article just a couple of days ago that really kind of lifted the curtain on what's going on here. And essentially, the setup is Icon Aircraft is a U.S. company that makes small amphibious planes with foldable wings, and it's marketed just for recreational use. Now, they have, for a number of years, had some Chinese investors. And what has apparently happened, according to the journal report, is that the U.S. investors and U.S. executives at the company, including, I believe, one of the founders, have grown somewhat disgruntled by the actions of the Chinese investors, in part because they claim that the Chinese investors have tried to whisk away the proprietary technology and take it back to China and use it for who knows what. But one could imagine that the U.S. government would see this as perhaps an example of exactly the phenomenon we're talking about in the Hytera case, and also more broadly, the phenomenon that we see with respect to BIS entity listings and other actions taken by the Commerce Department and others to prevent the civil-military fusion efforts of the Chinese government to take civilian technology and build upon that to use it to their military advantage. And so what has come out in this article, or what is reported in the article, is that some of the U.S. investors have claimed that this technology that was trying to be either expropriated or licensed, depending on who you believe, by the Chinese investors and taken back to China, actually does have military applications and actually is the subject of ongoing projects by the DoD and others in the government to see whether that could be whether that could be militarized. This technology could be militarized. So hold that thought for a moment, because what they did was essentially they then could not prevail upon their Chinese investors to stop with their licensing efforts or their expropriation efforts or their tech transfer efforts. And so what they did was they threatened to take the matter to CFIUS, and they did. They essentially reported themselves to CFIUS and said, CFIUS, you need to get involved here and stop this from happening, which is what is most notable, I think, about this, because we don't see this. We really do not see this, because once a U.S. investor or anybody takes a matter to CFIUS and puts it to their attention, and now reportedly the matter is in fact being reviewed and perhaps investigated by CFIUS at the moment as to whether or not they are going to take some action here to either unwind the Chinese investment or put in place some mitigation or take other measures. You sort of lose control of it, obviously, and that is the thing that nobody wants, because then you are at the mercy of the U.S. government. But here, that is apparently what happened, is that the U.S. investors resorted to taking the matter to CFIUS to stop the Chinese investors from absconding, if you believe their version of it, with their tech. Now, there are some this matter is the subject of, I think it looks like, multiple lawsuits at the moment between the various investors, and for their part, the Chinese investors claim that this is all just a cash grab on the part of the U.S. investors, and that they have sort of ginned up this claim that the technology and that the airplane that is the central sort of product of this company is in fact worthy of military use. But let's put that aside for the moment. The reality is, it seems that the U.S. investors did in fact take this matter to CFIUS in an effort to sort of stymie the efforts of the Chinese investors to run off with their technology. To my knowledge, and this example is cited in the article, we're at somewhat of a disadvantage, because obviously most CFIUS matters never get aired publicly and remain completely confidential. And it is unusual that the parties are talking so openly about what is going on behind the scenes as a matter is being reviewed by CFIUS. There is the Broadcom-Qualcomm matter from a few years ago, where Qualcomm, in a bid to stop a hostile takeover, did employ similar measures to get CFIUS to intervene. And in fact, President Trump did in fact prohibit that transaction and stop it from happening. But there are not too many instances that I'm aware of, from my time working with the committee to my time advising on these things in private practice, where the U.S. side will say, we're going to tattle on you, Chinese investors or foreign investors, and we're going to go to CFIUS and get them to step in and save us or help us here. So the question is just sort of, what do you make of this? And do we think this foretells a new era in the way that CFIUS may be brought in to perhaps, by, again, sort of disgruntled U.S. investors to protect themselves when they feel that they are vulnerable? Again, with a grain of salt, because we understand that there could be some other motives at play here for the U.S. investors. But still, what do you make of all this?
So I think, to start out, I mean, I don't have any of the real factual information, right, just what we read in the press. So I think most of what I'm going to say is going to be kind of couched in hypotheticals, because we don't know what's really going on here. But there's a lot of
speculate, though, so there's no bar to that.
No, the speculation is the most fun part. But the thing is that I just want to be careful to say I don't know what's going on there. I'm not trying to say that any of these things are going on there, but the fact pattern and the article just raises a host of really interesting issues about CFIUS and kind of where we are today. So on the one hand, I think that the set of facts as laid out by the U.S. investors, at least now, is kind of the reason that FIRMA was passed, right? We've got Chinese investors. Through their investment, they get enough of a control interest in the company that they can start to steal U.S. technology and take it back to China. I mean, that's what the complaint to CFIUS suggests is happening, at least from the U.S. side. And obviously, that's why FIRMA's there, and that's why CFIUS is there. And they're going to make sure that doesn't happen through, that the Chinese can't use investment to take technology out of the U.S. On the other hand, and this is kind of like the CFIUS matrix at this point, I mean, the U.S. investors, it's one thing to give kind of the U.S. government power in these sorts of transactions to really stop a national security harm. But at least, according to some of the allegations, if what's really happening is that the U.S. investors are sitting there thinking, okay, well, if you pay me enough, I'd be happy to, buy me out, and I'll walk away, and nobody will know the better for this, because it is commercial technology that's being sold to the public in the U.S. And so presumably, like, it probably can't be that highly controlled, although the planes look like they potentially could have some interesting military uses if you look at them closely. So who knows? But I'm just saying, like, it could be for real that this is not a national security concern, but because of the way firm is set up now, the U.S. you've created a real bargaining chip for minority U.S. investors, or even majority U.S. investors, because of some of the investment provisions of CFIUS, to really be able to go out and say, pay me more, or we're going to put this in front of CFIUS, and the investment that you've got now might get unwound, or you're going to be subject to all sorts of onerous conditions in your investment. So you can pay me now, and I'll take the money, or you can go through the whole CFIUS process. Which is it going to be? And it creates this real leverage that the U.S. investors didn't have before, which I don't think was the purpose of FIRMA. I don't think that was the point, was to make sure that, the U.S. could get a better bargain for selling away potential, national security threats. It was really to stop those if they were real, but to figure out, not to stop the fake ones in order to get the U.S. sellers more
Right.
money.
Well, to the point you made about whether or not the plane that's manufactured by this company is in fact could be adapted for military uses, I think hopefully and presumably, because DoD sits on CFIUS, they're purported to be looking or working on a project with this company. They will be able to clarify that, and the committee will be clear-eyed about whether that is or is not the case, because that they will have the authorities on that right there to weigh in on that. So presumably that is something that will get sorted out within the committee as they're looking at this, and we don't have any basis to know one way or the other based on the reporting. But the other point that you bring up is a good one, and obviously the way the timeline is laid out in the article, at least, the investment that was initially accepted from the Chinese investors, it seems, started certainly pre-FIRMA, and over time it sounds like the main Chinese investor accrued greater and greater interest and greater control. And so, now in a post-FIRMA world, I question whether that would really be able to happen kind of, outside of the prying eyes of CFIUS or anyway, right? We're sort of it's a little bit of an interesting scenario here, because it seems like, again, if I'm understanding the timeline from the reporting, that was all in a pre-FIRMA world. Then we kind of ended up in this post-FIRMA world. To Tim's point, there's general understanding and acknowledgement that the U.S. government's going to be very interested to sort of look into something like this if these types of allegations are being brought to them or made. And so CFIUS is happy to open a review or request a notice from these parties, because this kind of seems to be core to what exactly Tim said that FIRMA is designed to protect against. So whatever the ulterior motives are on either side, very hard to know, and we're not trying to weigh in on that. But I do think that it's just kind of a fascinating setup, and so will be interesting to see, because I presume, given the lawsuits and given the fact that these parties seem to have no problem sort of speaking publicly about all of this and kind of sniping at one another through the news media, we will be able to kind of keep an eye on this one and sort of see where it lands. No pun intended. With final disposition from CFIUS and or some kind of agreement that gets reached to resolve all of this. So yeah, just one that we really wanted to flag, because again, I think it kind of comes on the heels of some other issues that we were talking about last time today with respect to, again, tech transfers, China, and sort of the various tools that are now at the U.S. government's disposal to deal with these things. And this is sort of a fascinating one, especially with the way that it kind of got routed and how it got initiated and what may come of it.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to watch. I mean, this is kind of a real dichotomy, right? On the one hand, from one perspective, if you look at it one way, it's a threat to a core national interest that the U.S. investors were at least there to try and protect against before it got too late. On the other hand, if you look at it from another way, it's CFIUS being used to shake down Chinese investors. And I guess we'll find out what the truth is at some point, or maybe we won't because CFIUS is so secret. But what I'll be really interested to see is whether or not this becomes kind of a trend, whether it becomes a fad where essentially the U.S. Companies know that if they've got Chinese investors, they've got them over a barrel because of CFIUS, and so they can either kind of get them to do what they want, or they can go run tell CFIUS. And it'll be interesting to see how CFIUS responds to that. I mean, I doubt that what it really wants is to be used as a tool for a shakedown. On the other hand, there do seem to be some potential national security issues in here where they could be interested in.
Speaking of shakedown, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that I've seen some reporting recently that CFIUS is now once again engaging on the TikTok issue to determine what may come of that, because that has kind of gone into a bit of a limbo state since President Biden took office. And as all of our loyal listeners will recall, one of our most cherished and amusing facts that we discussed multiple times in 2020 was the idea that President Trump declared that there would have to be a sizable payment made in order for TikTok to continue to operate. So apropos of that, I think we will speaking of shakedowns, I think that's a good place to end when it comes to CFIUS and China. So that is our show for today. That is relatively brisk by our standards, although not quite lightning round style altogether. But that is it for today. This will be up at some point next week, so middle of February, and then we will likely not be back until the very end of the month with our next episode, in which case the entire global world order may have been remade in the interim. So we will likely have a lot more to say about all the topics that we talked about today and recently on the next go round. So
maybe we won't just be speculating on the next episode.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe that would be nice for a change if we had some concrete things to respond to rather than just speculation. Although we do like to speculate, as folks know. So with that, we will say goodbye. We'll wrap up for this time. So thanks to everybody. Stay well, stay safe, and stay sanctions free.
Stay warm, stay sanctions free.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.